The smell of lighter fluid always brings back the summer I turned 18. It is a chemical, biting stench that cuts through the back of the throat and settles deep in the lungs like ash. That morning, the grass in our backyard was still silver with heavy dew. My father stood over a rusted iron drum, a box of long fireplace matches in his massive, uncalloused hand. He didn't look like a man about to commit an act of structural violence. He looked like a priest officiating a long-overdue sacrifice. Spread across the damp lawn were the contents of my bedroom. 3 boxes of meticulously catalogued charcoal drawings, my acceptance letter to the Chicago Institute of Design, 4 years of high school textbooks with my own dense marginalia, and the vintage leather drafting satchel my grandfather had given me before he died. "You aren't going to art school, Julian," he said. His voice was entirely devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was the calm, bureaucratic tone he used at Arthur Vance and Associates when denying a commercial tenant an extension on their lease. "The world doesn't pay for doodles. It pays for concrete. It pays for land. I've given you 18 years of shelter, and you're choosing to waste your mind on vanity. If you won't clear the clutter from your head, I will clear it from my house." I didn't scream. I didn't run forward to snatch the leather bag from the grass. I knew that any display of raw emotion would only validate his theory that I was too fragile, too unformed to make my own choices. "Those are my things, Dad," I said, my voice barely above the rustle of the wind through the maples. "I bought the paper. I earned the scholarship." "Under my roof, everything belongs to the firm," he replied. He struck the match. The flame was a tiny, insignificant spark against the bright morning light, but when he dropped it into the oil-soaked crate of my drawings, the response was instantaneous. A roar of orange fire erupted, turning years of late-night labor into black, curling flakes that drifted up into the clear blue sky. He watched the flames reflect in his polished loafers, then turned his back on me to walk inside and pour his first cup of black coffee. I stood by that burning drum until the metal turned gray and the heat forced me back onto the gravel driveway. In that exact hour, while the smell of my own incinerated future clung to my clothes, the trajectory of my life shifted. I didn't pack a bag because I didn't have a bag left to pack. I walked out of the iron gates of his estate with nothing but my wallet, $300 of cash from a local framing shop job, and a cold, diamond-hard clarity. If Arthur Vance believed the world only valued concrete and land, then I would become the master of his entire landscape. The first 3 years were a blur of cheap, windowless basement apartments that smelled of damp drywall and boiled cabbage. I didn't go to art school. Instead, I enrolled in the hardest, most grueling finance and real estate law program available at the state university, working 40 hours a week as a night shift data entry clerk for a logistics firm. While other students went to bars or slept, I analyzed corporate structures, tax codes, and the complex machinery of commercial debt. I learned how holding companies operated, how distressed assets were liquidated, and how larger developers used leverage to swallow smaller, family-owned firms alive. Every time my eyes burned from the glare of the monitor at 3 in the morning, I would breathe in deeply, conjuring the memory of that chemical, smoky yard. It became my fuel. Arthur Vance never reached out. Through my aunt, I heard he considered my departure a temper tantrum and told the family I'd come crawling back to the firm the moment my pockets ran dry. He even took credit for my survival, telling his business partners that his tough love approach had finally forced me to abandon my childish hobbies and pursue a real degree. He thought he had broken me into compliance from afar. He had no idea. He was simply teaching his future liquidator how to operate without sentiment. By the time I was 26, I had founded Vanguard Holdings. It wasn't an office with gold lettering on the glass. It was a lean, aggressive investment vehicle backed by 3 institutional funds that valued my absolute precision in identifying undervalued regional commercial real estate. I didn't look at properties as places where people worked. I looked at them as mathematical puzzles. My specialty became acquiring the secondary debt of mid-sized firms that had overextended themselves during economic downturns. Arthur Vance and Associates was exactly that kind of firm. My father was an exceptional salesman of the old guard. He relied on handshakes, golf course agreements, and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. But he lacked foresight. As the commercial retail market shifted toward digital spaces and hybrid work models, his heavy investments in suburban strip malls and traditional multi-tenant office parks began to bleed. To keep the appearance of his opulent lifestyle intact, the country club memberships, the pristine lakefront house, the luxury sedans, he began quietly refinancing his core properties, taking on high-interest mezzanine loans from secondary lenders. He assumed he could always out-hustle the market. I tracked every single move he made through public filings, UCC liens, and industry whispers. I knew his debt-to-equity ratio before he did. I knew when his anchor tenants were planning to decline their lease renewals. For 5 years, I didn't buy a single piece of property in our home state. I waited until his firm reached the exact point of structural vulnerability. The tipping point arrived when Arthur Vance and Associates attempted to develop the Meridian Plaza, a massive, mixed-use commercial center that required $40 million in upfront capital. My father had secured $30 million from a traditional syndicate, but to cover the remaining gap, he committed the fatal error of pledging the firm's operational equity and his own personal executive retirement trust as collateral to a private credit fund called Apex Capital. What my father didn't know was that Apex Capital was a wholly owned subsidiary of a broader portfolio managed by an offshore entity. And that entity had just been acquired by Vanguard Holdings. The acquisition of his debt took 7 months of quiet, bureaucratic maneuvering. I sat in glass boardrooms in New York and Chicago, signing documents that transferred his liabilities from one ledger to another, until I held the legal strings to every single piece of earth he claimed to own. I bought his notes at a slight premium just to ensure no other buyers could interfere. I wanted total ownership of his financial oxygen. The day the foreclosure and restructuring notice arrived at his corporate office, I was already parked across the street in a nondescript black sedan. I watched through the tinted windows as his senior vice presidents began hurrying into the building, their faces pale under the morning sun. Half an hour later, my phone rang. It was an unrecognized number with the local area code. "Julian," his voice came through the speaker, older now, slightly frayed at the edges but still carrying that familiar, commanding weight. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but your mother told me you were involved with Vanguard. We need to talk. This corporate harassment is interfering with our quarterly refinancing." "It's not harassment, Arthur," I said, using his first name deliberately. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy enough to feel through the digital connection. "It's a structural transition. Your mezzanine loans went into technical default 30 days ago when your debt service coverage ratio dropped below the required 1.2 threshold. Page 42 of your agreement with Apex. I assume you read it before you signed away your life's work." "You think you can ruin me?" he barked, the old, volatile temper finally breaking through his calculated exterior. "I built this city while you were still coloring with crayons. I am the chairman of this firm. You cannot simply walk in here and take what took 40 years to cultivate." "I didn't take it," I replied smoothly, watching an armored courier truck pull up to his building to deliver the official corporate takeover papers. "You risked it on a bad market because you couldn't bear to look small to your peers. And just so we are completely clear on the new reality, as of 8 o'clock this morning, you are no longer the chairman. You are an uncompensated consultant with a revoked security clearance. I'm coming up to the office now to collect the keys." I hung up before he could respond. As I stepped out of the car, the air was crisp and clean, completely free from the scent of smoke. But as I walked toward the glass towers that bore my family's name, I made sure my posture was completely upright, my hands relaxed, and my mind entirely devoid of anger. I was simply clearing the clutter from the ledger. The glass and steel lobby of Arthur Vance and Associates was designed to intimidate. It featured 20-foot ceilings of polished gray travertine and an oversized, brutalist concrete reception desk that felt more like a defensive bunker than a greeting station. For 40 years, this room had signaled to every visitor exactly who my father was, a man who carved his name into the earth and expected everyone else to look up at it. When the security gates clicked open for me without requiring a badge, the two receptionists stared at their monitors, paralyzed by the internal memo that had hit their inboxes just 5 minutes prior. I didn't stop to savor their discomfort. I took the private elevator directly to the top floor, the hum of the machinery the only sound in the shaft. When the doors opened on the penthouse suite, the chaos was palpable. Paperwork was being shoved into shredders. Senior partners were huddled in doorways speaking in frantic whispers, and my father's administrative assistant of 30 years, Evelyn, sat at her desk with red-rimmed eyes. When she saw me, her jaw tightened. She didn't see a successful businessman returning home. She saw the monster who had come to eviscerate the kingdom. "He's in his office, Julian," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But the board is." "The board has already been dissolved, Evelyn," I interrupted gently, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "You can take the rest of the day off. Your severance package will be delivered by HR before 5 o'clock. I didn't wait for her response. I pushed open the heavy, double-oak doors of the corner office. Arthur Vance was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the suburban sprawl he had spent his life developing. He hadn't taken off his tailored wool overcoat, as if remaining dressed for the elements would somehow protect him from the climate shift inside his own building. His hair was entirely white now, and his shoulders were slightly more rounded than I remembered. But when he turned to face me, his eyes still possessed that sharp, predatory glint that had terrified me throughout my childhood. "You look expensive, Julian," he said, his voice dripping with an icy paternal condescension. He didn't offer his hand. Instead, he walked over to his massive mahogany desk, a custom piece carved from a single fallen tree, and leaned against it. "I see the finance world has taught you how to buy a nice suit, but it clearly didn't teach you anything about loyalty or how real business is conducted." "Real business is conducted through enforceable contracts, Arthur," I said, walking to the opposite side of the room and sitting down in one of the leather guest chairs. I purposely didn't take the seat behind his desk. Taking his chair would imply that I wanted his job. I didn't want his job, I wanted his assets. "You failed to perform on your debt obligations. Vanguard stepped into the shoes of your creditors. This isn't a personal dispute, it's a standard liquidation." "A standard liquidation." He let out a harsh, dry laugh that sounded like gravel shifting. "You targeted my firm. You spent months buying up our secondary paper from every distressed debt broker in the Midwest. Don't sit there and play the cold logician with me. You did this out of spite because I wouldn't let you ruin your life with art supplies 10 years ago." I looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between us until the hum of the building's ventilation system became deafening. "You always miscalculated my motivations," I said softly. "Spite is an emotional expense, and emotion has a terrible return on investment. I bought your firm because your business model was obsolete and your capital structure was completely exposed. If I hadn't bought this debt, a vulture fund from New York would have done it next month, and they would have liquidated your personal assets without giving you the courtesy of a conversation." "A conversation," he walked toward me, his fists clenching at his sides. "You've frozen our operating accounts. You've put a hold on the construction draws for the Meridian project. And my legal team tells me there's a rider in the Apex Capital contract that locks down the executive retirement pool. My pension, Julian. 40 years of deferred compensation locked behind a corporate firewall. That isn't business. That's an execution." "It's an optimization," I corrected him, pulling a leather-bound folder from my briefcase and placing it on the table between us. When you pledged the firm's master treasury as collateral for the Meridian mezzanine loan, you didn't exclude the corporate pension trust. You signed a blanket cross-collateralization clause. The fund is currently underfunded by $12 million due to the poor performance of your commercial retail portfolio. As the new majority stakeholder and principal creditor, I am legally obligated to secure those funds to protect the junior employees' retirement accounts. Your personal executive allocation, the top-tier pension, is being withheld to cover the deficit. His face went from pale to a deep, dangerous crimson. The veneer of the dignified corporate statesman completely vanished, revealing the volatile tyrant who used to rule our household by decree. He slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the suite. That money is mine. I built that trust from zero. I earned every single dollar of that pension while you were playing around with charcoal and acting like a victim, he roared, leaning over me, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. You think you're smart because you found a loophole in a contract. You're nothing but a thief who stole his father's keys while he was sleeping. I gave you life, Julian. I gave you the very name you used to sign your checks. I didn't flinch. I didn't lean back. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes, seeing the exact moment that fear began to mix with his rage. He wasn't just angry. He was realizing, for the very first time in his life, that he was completely powerless against someone else's will. You gave me a name, and then you told me that under your roof everything belonged to the firm, I said, my voice dropping to a level whisper that seemed to command the room far more than his shouting. Do you remember that morning, Arthur? The iron drum in the backyard, the lighter fluid. You told me the world doesn't pay for vanity, it pays for concrete and land. You told me you were clearing the clutter from your house. He blinked, a sudden flicker of recognition crossing his features, followed quickly by a defensive hardening of his jaw. That was 10 years ago. It was a lesson in discipline. A father has a right to correct his son when he's throwing his future away. And a creditor has a legal right to correct a debtor when he's throwing his capital away, I countered, standing up slowly so that I was looking down at him. You wanted me to learn the value of concrete and land. I learned it perfectly. I learned that if you don't own the dirt beneath your feet, your choices don't matter. You burned my future to teach me a lesson. Now I am using your own curriculum to educate you. I opened the folder. Inside were the termination agreements, the corporate restructuring blueprints, and the legal transfer documents for the Arthur Vance Executive Pension Trust. As of this afternoon, the firm will be rebranded as Vanguard Commercial Real Estate, I announced, my voice completely devoid of theatricality. The Meridian project is being halted indefinitely. The land will be partitioned and sold to a residential developer to cover the outstanding balance on the mezzanine notes. The corporate headquarters will be downsized to a single floor in a suburban office park. And your executive pension is permanently frozen and reallocated to indemnify the retirement plans of the office staff, the maintenance crews, and the junior analysts you were planning to lay off next quarter to keep your personal dividends afloat. He looked at the papers, then back up at me, his hands visibly shaking now. You're going to leave me with nothing. After everything I did to build this family name. You'll keep the lakefront house, I said, closed the folder and picked up my briefcase. Vanguard is releasing the lien on your primary residence as a gesture of structured goodwill. You can live out your retirement there, Arthur. You can sit on the porch, look at the water and think about the market. But you will never hold a piece of commercial real estate again. You will never sign a lease. And you will never step foot in this building after 5 o'clock today. He slumped back against his desk, the massive mahogany piece suddenly looking far too large for the man leaning against it. He looked defeated, but more than that, he looked old. The myth of the invincible Arthur Vance had been dissolved by a few columns of figures on a digital balance sheet. Your mother will never forgive you for this, he whispered, looking down at his polished loafers, the same style of shoes he had worn while watching my youth burn in a rusted barrel. My mother knows exactly who you are, Arthur. She's just been waiting for someone with enough liquidity to prove it, I said. I walked toward the double doors, my shoes making no sound on the thick wool carpet. As my hand touched the brass handle, I paused and looked back over my shoulder. He hadn't moved. He was still staring at the floor, a relic of a dying era trapped in a room of glass and stone. I'll have security send up some boxes for your personal effects, I added quietly. Make sure you pack carefully. I'd hate for anything of value to get left behind. The sound of cardboard boxes being taped shut is a flat, unceremonious noise. It has none of the resonance of a gavel hitting wood or a closing bell ringing on a trading floor, but it signals the end of an empire just as permanently. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the top floor of the tower was almost entirely silent. The frantic whispering had stopped. The junior analysts had packed their bags and left early, realizing that their jobs were safe but their old world was gone. I sat in the small, glass-walled conference room down the hall from my father's office, watching the twilight bleed across the city skyline. On the table before me was a single, elegant glass of water and the final execution order for Vanguard's restructuring plan. My mother arrived at 4:15. She didn't use the private elevator. She came up through the main reception, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the travertine floor. When she entered the conference room, she didn't look angry. She wore a tailored cream coat, her silver hair pulled back into a flawless knot, looking exactly like the woman who had hosted fundraisers and corporate dinners for my father for over 3 decades. She sat down opposite me, placing her leather handbag on the table with deliberate care. She looked at me for a long time, studying the lines of my face, as if searching for the boy who used to draw charcoal sketches on the kitchen table after midnight. "He called me from his desk, Julian," she said, her voice smooth, measured, and entirely calm. "He sounded like a child who had been left behind in a park. I haven't heard him sound that small since his own father died." "He isn't small, Mother," I replied, keeping my hands folded on the table. "He's just the exact size of his actual net worth now. Without the leverage and the corporate facade, he's just a man with a house by the lake." She let out a soft, tired sigh, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker on below us. "You think I didn't know what he was doing all those years? You think I didn't see the way he controlled every room, every contract, every person in his life?" She looked back at me, her eyes surprisingly clear. "When he burned your things that morning, I went out to the yard after you walked away. The fire was out, but the air smelled like scorched carbon for a week. I found a single scrap of your drawing paper near the hedge. It was just a corner, a sketch of the old oak tree by the gate. I kept it in my jewelry box." I felt a sudden, fleeting tightening in my chest, a ghost of an old emotion, but I cleared it away instantly. "Why didn't you stop him?" "Because you cannot stop an avalanche with a conversation, Julian," she said softly. "Arthur believed his own myth. He believed that because he could build things out of concrete, he was made of concrete himself. If I had defended you that morning, he would have divorced me, taken the assets, and left both of us with nothing. He had the lawyers, the capital, and the power. I had to wait, and I knew even then that you weren't the type to crawl back." She reached across the table and touched the edge of the leather folder containing the pension forfeiture documents. "You've completely blocked his executive trust." "The legal team finalized it 10 minutes ago," I said, showing her the signed ledger entries. "The $12 million deficit in the general employee pool has been fully indemnified by his personal account. The remaining balance has been converted into a closed annuity that will pay out exactly enough to cover the property taxes and basic maintenance on the lakefront house. He won't starve, Mother, but he will never have a line of credit again. He will never be a landlord." She nodded slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of her mouth. It wasn't a smile of malice. It was the quiet satisfaction of a spectator watching a perfectly executed chess match reach its inevitable endgame. He's packing his desk now. He's trying to figure out how to carry his awards down to the car without looking like he's fleeing. He doesn't have to flee, I said, standing up. He can take his time. The building belongs to Vanguard now, but I'm not a tyrant. I'm just the landlord. I walked out of the conference room and down the long, carpeted corridor toward the corner office. The double doors were propped open with a heavy brass doorstop. Inside, Arthur Vance was standing next to a single cardboard box. The mahogany desk was completely bare, its polished surface reflecting the dim fluorescent lights of the ceiling. In his hand, he held a heavy, crystal award, the Regional Developer of the Year trophy from 1998. When he heard my footsteps, he didn't look up immediately. He carefully placed the crystal trophy into the box, wrapping it in a sheet of bubble wrap with slow, deliberate movements. "Your mother is downstairs," I said from the doorway. "I know," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of the thunder that had defined my entire upbringing. He finally looked up, his eyes weary, surrounded by deep shadows. "She didn't come up to help me pack. She came up to make sure I actually left. She's a pragmatist, Arthur. She understands when a lease has expired." He leaned his hands on the edge of the bare desk, looking down at the dark wood. "I spent 40 years building this firm, Julian. 40 years of 60-hour weeks, dealing with corrupt city officials, fighting unions, taking risks that would have broken lesser men. I did all of it to build a legacy. For the family. For you, even if you don't believe it." "You did it for your own reflection in the glass, Arthur," I said, walking into the room and stopping a few feet from him. "If you had done it for the family, you wouldn't have risked the employee pension funds to finance your own vanity project at Meridian Plaza. You wouldn't have treated your son's mind like clutter that needed to be cleared from your property. You built an empire because you loved the feeling of holding the strings. But you forgot that strings can be pulled from both ends." He looked at the single box of his belongings, then back at me. For a second, just a fraction of a moment, I saw a flash of the old, terrifying man who had struck the match in the morning dew. But the fire was gone. There was nothing left but the gray ash of a collapsed career. "You really are my son," he whispered, a bitter, tragic note of pride slipping into his tone. Only an absolute Vance could have planned something this cold. Only someone with my blood could have waited 10 years to strike a default clause. "No," I said, looking him dead in the eye, my voice entirely steady. "A Vance would have done this out of anger. A Vance would have shouted, made a scene, and demanded an apology. I didn't do this because I'm your son, Arthur. I did this because I'm the market. And the market doesn't care about your bloodline, your legacy, or your pride. It only cares about the balance sheet." I stepped back, allowing him a clear path to the door. "Your security clearance is officially deactivated at 5:00 p.m. It is currently 4:52. I suggest you take your box." He stood up straight, pulling his coat around him, trying to summon one last shred of the dignity that had once commanded boardrooms across the state. He picked up the heavy cardboard box, his muscles straining slightly under the weight. He didn't say goodbye. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine slightly, a final, pathetic attempt at physical assertion. I watched him walk down the long corridor, past the empty desks and the darkened offices, until he reached the elevator. The silver doors slid open. He stepped inside with his single box of memories, and the doors closed with a soft, final click. The digital display above the shaft began its countdown. 2015-10-1. Lobby. He was gone. I turned back into the empty corner office. The room felt massive now, stripped of his personality, stripped of his towering ego. The bare mahogany desk sat in the center like an altar in an abandoned temple. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the sprawling city. The grid of streets, the glowing headlights of cars stuck in rush-hour traffic, the distant silhouettes of office parks and residential developments. It all stretched out before me, vast, cold, and beautifully structured. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object I had carried with me all afternoon. It wasn't a contract, a calculator, or a phone. It was a single, high-grade professional charcoal pencil. I walked over to the pristine, bare mahogany desk that had once belonged to the chairman of Arthur Vance and Associates. I didn't sit down in his chair. I stood over the wood, pressed the dark carbon tip firmly against the immaculate, expensive grain of the desk, and began to draw. With long, sharp, mathematically precise strokes, I sketched the outline of a rusted iron drum, the flames rising from its core, turning into a flock of black birds that flew upward, entirely free from the earth, filling the sky until there was nothing left but light.